So once they got going, the breakout was very quick out of Normandy. June 27th, the Allies captured Cherbourg. I'm mispronouncing it, and I apologize. Late 44, they break out. Allies liberate St. Lo. August 25th, they liberate Paris. By October, they have pushed the Germans out of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Over in the Pacific, the Japanese were defeated at the Battle of Guadalcanal in early 1943, and this is when the Allies go on the offensive. The strategy is called island hopping, and as you can see here on the map of the Pacific Islands campaign, island hopping was planned by General MacArthur and Nimitz. They believed that trying to take all of the islands that they held was going to take too long, so they would leapfrog over and basically take out the more important, bigger islands and let the little islands with the Japanese soldiers on it basically run out of supplies and wither and die. MacArthur would come up from Australia from the south, and Nimitz would move from Hawaii. During 1943, MacArthur moved through the Solomon Islands along the coast of New Guinea. So on the map you can see where New Guinea is along the coast there. You see the Solomons, New Guinea. MacArthur liberates New Guinea in August of 44. And in October he begins his invasion of the Philippines. He attacks the southern Philippine island of Leyte. The Japanese Navy comes out in force at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and the entire naval force is destroyed by the American Navy. MacArthur lands with great pomp and circumstance, and the final stage of the war against Japan is about to begin. Over in Europe, in December of 1944, the Allies have gotten to the German border, but the Allied offensive stalls, and on December 16th, the Germans launch their final offensive. They launch a counterattack along a 75-mile stretch of the Ardennes forest. This part of the Allied line was basically defended by inexperienced American troops, and the cold weather canceled out air cover. Because of the weakness in the lines, the Germans were able to push a great bulge into the Allied lines, thus the Battle of the Bulge, threatening Belgian towns of Liège and Antwerp. Antwerp was basically a port city where we were getting a lot of supplies. If they were able to retake Antwerp, that would cut off a lot of supplies flowing into Europe and supporting the invasion. December 20th, the Germans surround the Battle of Bastogne, where it was being defended by the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles. The Germans demanded their surrender. The American commander, General Anthony McCulloch, relayed a one-word answer: nuts. By Christmas Day, the German advance had been stopped. By January of 45, the Germans had been driven back to their original lines. The 10-day Battle of the Bulge cost the Allies nearly 77,000 troops. The Germans lost 120,000 troops, and their ability to actually fight an offensive war was severely damaged. From this point on, the Germans would be fighting a defensive war. The offensive war was over. It is at Yalta where we have the final pieces of the surrender and the reshaping of Europe will be taking place. So this is where the Russians and the Americans and the British agree on how post-war Europe will be taken care of. The Soviet army had entered Poland in mid-1944. They called for free elections in Eastern Europe after the war was over. The agreements at Yalta were very controversial. Critics say that Roosevelt gave too much to Stalin and that he basically betrayed the people of Eastern Europe. One of the things that he promised was that Eastern Europe would be the buffer zone for the Soviets, because the Soviets don't have had two invasions come through that part of the world, and they needed to control it so those invasions wouldn't come again. The defenders of Roosevelt at Yalta argue that unless the United States had been prepared to force the Soviets out of Europe, basically all Roosevelt could do was to trust that Stalin would hold democratic elections in those territories that were liberated by the Soviet Red Army. It also called for Germany to be divided into 4 zones: the British, American, French, and Soviet. Also, it brought the Soviets into the war against Japan after the defeat of Germany and established the United Nations. So the fall of Germany was only a matter of time. Allied air forces had destroyed many German cities. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had swept through Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. By April of 1945, Eisenhower decided that the destruction of the German army was actually more important than the capture of Berlin, so he allowed the Soviets to capture Berlin. The Soviets had an army of 1.25 million within reach of Berlin. So Eisenhower gave the prize of Berlin to Stalin and the Red Army. So March 1945, the Americans crossed the Rhine River into Germany. April of 1945, they occupied the Ruhr River Valley, which was a major area of German industry. April of 1945, the Americans are within 50 miles of Berlin. The death of Roosevelt actually gave the Germans, or Hitler at least, an idea that maybe this would force the Americans out of the war. It didn't. April 30th of 1945, Hitler commits suicide, and on May 7th, 1945, Germany surrenders and victory in Europe is achieved. Now that the island hopping has been successful, we have better bombers to bomb Japan. Longer range bombers, these would be the B-29 Super Fortresses. So they were at the Battle of Iwo Jima. 21,000 Japanese defenders basically fight to the death against the American forces landing there. 200 survived to surrender. At the Battle of Okinawa, over 100,000 Japanese defenders, only 11,000 survived to surrender. One of the things that the Japanese have is a code that basically the military twisted called Bushido. It's about honor, and they twisted it so much that if they basically said if you die, or if you surrender, that you will not only shame your family, but you'll shame future generations and past generations. Also, the Japanese told horror stories of what the Americans would do to you. Killing children, raping women. So in Okinawa, a lot of the Japanese defenders and their families committed suicide, throwing themselves off of cliffs to avoid being captured by the Americans. This is also where you see kamikaze attacks on the Navy, planes piloted by very inexperienced pilots. Their only job is to destroy American ships. Banzai charges, where they would attack American positions and just get mowed down, just in hopes of basically dying also for the glory of Japan and the emperor, but also to die for their family so they would not be basically dishonored for the rest of their lives and dishonoring their family. So as this is going on, Stalin, Churchill, and Truman, who is replaced by Attlee as prime minister, gather at Potsdam to decide how to administer the Nazi Germany, who had just surrendered. The Potsdam Declaration also outlined the terms of surrender for Japan. The Potsdam Declaration was issued in July of 1945, and basically outlined the terms of surrender of Japan. And this basically said that the ultimatum stated that if Japan did not surrender, it would face prompt and utter destruction. Japan basically rejected this, which directly led to the President Truman's decision to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this is always up for debate, did he do this to end the war, or was he actually doing this to let the Russians know, or the Soviets know, that we had nuclear weapons? So the Manhattan Project was headed by Oppenheimer and focused on creating the nuclear bomb, an atomic bomb. The first atomic bomb was detonated in the New Mexico desert in July of 1945. After Truman became president, he had very little time to find out if he should use the bomb. His military commanders basically told him that the invasion of Japan would probably cost about 250,000 Allied troops would die in the initial invasion of Japan. MacArthur estimated that the Japanese would continue a guerrilla-style resistance for up to 10 years. They saw this on the islands in Okinawa and Iwo Jima, that the Japanese would continue to fight. So Truman basically told them to surrender on August 3rd, 1945, or face utter destruction. When they failed to surrender, he dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, killing 78,000 people in an instant. 70,000 later died of radiation poisoning. On August 9th, he dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, killing 40,000. After the bombing at Nagasaki, the Japanese government offered to surrender on the condition that Emperor Hirohito be allowed to keep his throne. Not unconditional, but Truman agreed, and August 4th was named Victory in Japan Day, or VJ Day. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, the Japanese signed the formal documents of surrender. So that basically ends World War II. So the Allies fought World War II against the Nazi theories of racial supremacy. In what ways did the United States fail in this war? The United States government interred Japanese Americans, many of whom were American citizens, solely because they were of Japanese descent. In 1943, whites attacked African Americans in urban race riots. The riots in Detroit lasted for 2 days and killed 34 people. The U.S. government refused to come to the aid of European refugees before the war, and when they were confronted by evidence of the Nazi Holocaust in 1942, the government only made modest efforts to rescue European Jews and denied requests that Allied bombers disrupt the killing at Auschwitz. How did the war benefit Americans? President Roosevelt's secret deal with Winston Churchill, like I said earlier, secured new American bases in the Western Hemisphere. War production provided jobs, increased wages, and ended the Great Depression. Many industries employed women, like Rosie the Riveter that you've seen. Many minorities in jobs also added, the minorities had a chance because it was once limited only to white men. America expanded its military power in order to meet the threat of the Axis, and the United States exited the war with the atomic bomb and a weapon that gave them a distinct advantage over potential rivals. Our potential rival, of course, turning out to be the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, when the war ended, another war began, and we will talk about that right after this, or when you decide to watch it.